That's our job.
But we're not being
In our town of Halloween.
A corpse should be left well alone. Hello everyone and welcome to day 21 of Terrorthon, Psychological Horror. It's a subgenre of horror that focuses less on splatter and gore and in-your-face jump scares and is more creepy and under the surface and gets into your head. So let's define it first of all. What is the difference between psychological horror and a more traditional horror? So a psychological horror will focus more on the emotional, mental and psychological states of the audience to mainly disturb them. And they most often feature mentally unstable protagonists as well. The subgenre will mainly play with the audience's perception of what's real and what isn't. And there's often like a thriller, a mystery element included. What is real? What is not real? And if there's a monster featuring, that usually will not be visible. At least not to the audience, perhaps to the main character. Psychological horrors often employ plot twists as well, right at the very end. Oh my god, it was real. Oh my god, it wasn't real. You never know with these movies. The characters will commonly be battling inner demons, such as lust or hatred towards another character, or paranoia, or some deep-seated trauma that they've suffered in the past. And unlike traditional horror movies, which often feature jump scares and heart-pounding action, psychological horror mostly aims to get into the audience's head, and it's a much more slow burn of a scare, and it will last a lot longer, I think, than a more traditional, say, jump scare, for example. The roots of psychological horror can be found in Gothic horror, which we've already discussed this year, such as The Castle of Otranto, Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, and Edgar Allan Poe as well. These were all early examples of psychological horror long before it had that label. And not too long after these works were released, movies began to be produced. And in the movies, the effect is created more through atmosphere, an eerie soundtrack, suggestion, and they will often exploit the audience and main character's psychology to achieve its scares, as opposed to loud violins and monsters jumping out of the shadows. However, psychological horror movies can still show graphic violence and more traditional scares, but when you're watching one of these, you will definitely know it. You'll be thinking about it long after the credits have rolled. Which is good because these movies often reward repeat viewings to see things that you missed the first time around, maybe even the second or the third time. So psychological horror films are a personal favourite of mine for these reasons. They have much more of a lasting impact, and I would say in many ways they're classier than your average horror film, not to sound like a hipster, but it's the truth, man. Quite possibly the first ever psychological horror movie was The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which came out in 1920. And which we never stop discussing on Terrorthon. What I find interesting is that any modern audience who goes back and watches this movie, or any silent horror movie, could consider it psychological horror, because we're just so disconnected from that nowadays. You obviously never see silent movies, so the lack of sound and the jittery movement, it all comes together to create a real nightmare-like feel. So that's why I say go back and watch these early silent movies. You'll get a far different effect than what the people at the time got, and I would say it's pure psychological. Speaking of the silent movies, the next one to come out that you could call psychological horror would be Vampire in 1932 by the Germans. Again, they obviously had horror down in these early days. And this again is well worth watching nowadays. It was way ahead of its time in terms of getting into your head and making you question, did I just see that just now? It's very, very good for that reason. Well worth a watch. And then once again, way ahead of its time, we had Cat People in 1942. This movie is not discussed anywhere near as much as it should be. It was pioneering in so many ways. Like, it explores a woman's sexuality and the psychology that entails, and yeah, it's very interesting viewing. Go do that one as well. And then any excuse to talk about this movie, Carnival of Souls in 1962, made in a very low budget. I don't think the director was even aiming for psychological horror, but he's certainly achieved it in my opinion. This movie just feels like a nightmare put to film and is highly effective. And then we had a blockbuster psychological horror movie in Rosemary's Baby, released in 1968. I personally find this movie to be quite overrated, but people still talk about it to this day, so it clearly had a real lasting impact, and it's probably worth your time. I just don't think it's all that great, because I've probably seen it imitated so many times. And from that point on, psychological horror was here to stay. It was often employed in giallo movies in Italy. And even to this day, psychological horror movies continue to come out. We've got The Lighthouse, The Babadook, Perfect Blue in 1997, an anime psychological horror. And of course it spilled over to video games as well, with the likes of Phantasmagoria in 1995 and the ultimate, Silent Hill in 1999. So as you can see, despite many considering it quite a niche genre, it has exploded in popularity, especially in recent years, and deserves its dues as a very unique piece of the horror puzzle. See you tomorrow.